Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. It begins, as many forgotten things do, with a change in silence. You might imagine yourself standing on a quiet shore of the Black Sea, today's coastline of beach resorts and concrete piers, but a shoreline lost in time before the sea was what it is now. The breeze is warm, the sky low and gray. In the distance, birds skim across marshy lakes and freshwater streams. The ground beneath your feet is in sand's rich earth, thick with life, whispering that once, long ago, it belonged to farmers, but now that earth is buried beneath layers of salt water and sediment. All that's left are questions. Story of the Black Sea flood doesn't come from a single ruin or a dramatic ancient account. It comes from silt. It's from shells that shouldn't be there, from freshwater mollusks drowned under marine ones, from tiny changes in sediment color measured by researchers digging deep into the seabed in long metal tubes. What they found surprised them. Roughly 7,600 years ago, before the pyramids were built, before the Epic of Gilgamesh was written, before even the first cities rose in Mesopotamia, the Black Sea, Tain, may have been the scene of one of Earth's great environmental events, according to a controversial hypothesis first proposed by marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the late 1990s. This massive inland lake, once ringed with fertile land, may have flooded catastrophically due to the rising waters of the Mediterranean Sea. Not a gentle swelling, but a wall of water. The idea begins with the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago. The Earth's great ice sheets began to melt. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, glaciers retreated and the seas rose. Coastlines moved, islands vanished, and inland lakes, those fed by glacial runoff and protected by natural land barriers, began to change. One such body was the freshwater lake that sat where the Black Sea now lies, fed by rivers like the Danube, Dniester, and Dnieper. It sat hundreds of feet below global sea level, protected from the salty waters of the Mediterranean by the narrow land bridge we now call the Bosporus. But water finds a way. In around 5600 BCE, the balance shifted. The Mediterranean's, swollen from melting glaciers and global sea rise pushed up against the Bosporus. The natural dam failed. What followed, according to Ryan and Pittman's hypothesis, was a flood that roared through the Bosporus at perhaps 200 times the force of Niagara Falls. A wall of salt water surged into the freshwater basin, drowning plains, destroying ecosystems, and permanently altering the geography of southeastern Europe. An entire world submerged it by war, nor fire, but by water. What makes this event so compelling is not just its scale, but its possible consequences. Picture the people who may have lived on those plains. Neolithic farmers who had domesticated plants and animals, built villages, stored grain, and carved out their lives by freshwater streams. Their homes, their tools, their traditions, it's all buried in a matter of days, or perhaps weeks, beneath the advancing tide. There are no written records from these people. They lived before writing, before empires, before memory as we know it. But there are whispers in myth, in the ancient stories of Mesopotamia. There's a tale of a flood so vast it covered the earth. In the tale of Utnapishtim, from the Epic of Gilgamesh, a man is warned by a god to build a boat. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah builds an ark. In Greek myth, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a deluge sent by Zeus. In all of these, the world is drowned in. Only a few survive. Coincidence? Perhaps or perhaps memories of an ancient, real event, past. down through oral tradition for thousands of years, eventually wove their way into written myth. Not the exact event, not the specific geography, but the feeling of it. The sense of something lost. A memory so traumatic it carved itself into the bones of culture. Still, many archaeologists and geologists remain skeptical. Some argue the flooding of the Black Sea was not sudden, but gradual, that the flow of water into the basin was steady over years, not catastrophic, that while coastal lands were submerged, they weren't swept away in a matter of days. There are good reasons for caution. The layers of sediment tell stories, but they don't speak in human language. The absence of ruins beneath the waves doesn't mean no one lived there only. That would rot. That mud bricks dissolve, and that sometimes what we're looking for isn't where we expected. Others raise the question, even if the flood happened quickly, were there truly people living on the shores? Could we ever confirm that? That is the quiet frustration of prehistoric history. So much has been lost, not just buildings and artifacts, tier one of facts, but entire ways of life. Cultures that rose, flourished, and vanished before the first written word. Peoples who never etched their names into stone, who never made monuments, who left only a trace in the soil land, sometimes not even that. And yet, absence is not silence. Every myth about a flood may carry an echo of these forgotten waters. In the early 2000s, explorer Robert Ballard, best known for discovering the Titanic, joined the search. He and his team found signs of ancient shorelines deep beneath the Black Sea's modern surface. Submerged river valleys, layers of freshwater sediment buried beneath salt water, even traces of what may have been human habitational wooden structure buried in mud, hundreds of feet below the surface. But conclusive evidence remains elusive. It always is when dealing with time measured not in centuries, but in layers of clay. Still, the question lingers. If the Black Sea flood did happen suddenly, and if people lived there, what did they lose? What ways of life vanished, quietly and without inscription? What memories were carried inland by the survivors, woven into stories for children, told around fires, distorted by time? What languages drowned, never written down? What tools, recipes, beliefs, what dreams? And now we return to you sitting quietly, maybe in bed, maybe drifting. You may have heard of Noah's Ark, or Atlantis, or the flood that cleansed the earth. But underneath those stories, there may be a quieter, older truth that once, long ago, the sea moved where it was not welcome, and what was lost, we may never fully know, but we remember it in echoes, in the myths that make no sense, in the gaps between riverbanks and the salt, where there should be none, be none. You wake again in a place between centuries. The waters have retreated, but they did not go quietly. They left behind a landscape smeared in silt and memory. A layer of fine mud coats the valleys, pressed down by time into compact strata, the kind a paleontologist might one day chip away with brushes and careful hands. But in this moment, no one is digging grass. There is only silence, broken by the shifting of waterlogged wood, creak of drowned trees leaning into soft collapse, and the distant murmur of streams where cities once may have stood. This section of the story begins here in the long, damp aftermath of flood across the globe, in widely separated regions: Mesopotamia, India, China. The Americas archaeologists have encountered something strangely similar. Sedimentary layers, sometimes only a foot thick, sometimes several meters deep, nestled within ancient ruins or cutting across the layers of human habitation like the punctuation of a forgotten disaster. These aren't myths. These are real. Let's walk through one such layer, not in Sumer or Egypt, but in the Harappan city of Mohenjo-Daro. In the 1920s, excavators working in the Indus Valley stumbled upon an extraordinary city, laid out in rational grids, featuring sewer systems, public baths, granaries, and no apparent palaces. It was a society built, seemingly, not around kings, but around planning. But then came the mud. Midway through the city's stratigraphy, in parts of its lower town, archaeologists found what they called the flood layer. It sat above a stratum of occupation, and beneath another of rebuilding. It was thick, composed of silt and debris, seemingly laid down by rising water. Had the Indus simply swollen its banks? Or had something more catastrophic occurred? Mud wasn't just an inconvenient truth, it was a signpost, a quiet divider between the time before and the time after. No writing tells us what happened. Saharapins, for all their advanced civilization, left no Rosetta Stone. Their script remains undeciphered, so we sift the clues from bricks and soil. In the absence of explanation, the flood becomes the axis of speculation. Was it seasonal? Sudden? Did it displace hundreds? Thousands? Did the survivors walk away from a civilization in decline? Or did the water hasten its fall? In nearby Mesopotamia, similar clues lie hidden in the strata of ancient cities like Shuapek and Kish, layers of clean clay silt, interrupting the usual sequence of domestic debris and broken pottery. One such layer, perhaps a meter thick, has been dated to around 2900 BCE. It corresponds suspiciously well to a time when Sumerian king lists abruptly begin, when kingship is described as having descended from heaven after a great flood. But what if this wasn't just a poetic metaphor? What if the city-states had been washed clean, some destroyed, some merely soaked tanned? What survived was reorganized under new leaders, who claimed divine legitimacy precisely because memory had become fluid. Imagine a world where time is no longer linear. A family lives beside the Tigris in a village of baked clay houses. Their ancestors tilled the same plot, respected the same river. They knew the flood would come. They expected it each season, like a traveler arriving muddy and irritable, but expected. But one year, the waters do not behave. The winds are wrong. The snowmelt comes early. The rain is heavier. The water rises not in days, but in hours. And when it retreats, the house is gone. The field is gone. The path to the temple has vanished beneath a new course of river. The village is no longer a village. It is memory half covered in silt and questions. Where do you go? In such moments, stories become the only map. If the landscape no longer recognizes you, the mind reaches back to myth. You tell your children about the flood that came from the gods, because the alternative, that it came from nothing, for no reason, is unbearable. This is how floods birth myth, but the flood also drowns things too ordinary to be saved. Think of books, of tablets, of scrolls. The Sumerians wrote on clay, which could survive if baked, but easily dissolved if damp. The Egyptians wrote on papyrus, stronger than it looks, but no match for water. The Chinese wrote on bamboo slips, tied with cords, their wisdom vulnerable to rot. The Olmecs carved stone, but recorded myth and memory in murals and organic pigments that faded fast. And now, think of what those floods erased in just the grand cities and palaces, but the shopping lists, the letters, the names of small gods who did not survive the catastrophe. What vanished were the margins of history. Even in the ancient flood myths, we see hints of earlier stories being replaced. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a great flood that swept away the world. But within that myth lies a subtext that knowledge was lost, that some older world had been wiped clean and rewritten. In the version found on clay tablets, Utnapishtim survives the flood and is granted immortality. But even he cannot recall all that was before. What if the story of the flood is a palimpsest? Each telling, each retelling adds a layer. The mud comes. The city falls. A new city rises atop it, its bricks laid over the broken bones of an older one. The old gods fade. The new ones take their names. What's left is not a clear timeline, but a stratigraphy of forgetting. And yet, if you dig carefully, the flood becomes a lens. Not all floods were global. Most weren't, but to those who lived through them, they may as well have been. A single valley washed clean feels like the end. The world, if your whole world fit inside that valley. In 1997, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman published a theory suggesting that the Black Sea had once been a freshwater lake. Its shores home to early farming communities. Around 5600 BCE, they proposed. Rising sea levels from the melting of glaciers caused the Mediterranean to breach the Bosporus, flooding the lake and transforming it into the salty sea we know today. The water, they said, would have surged with the force of 200 Niagara Falls, raising the sea level by hundreds of feet in months. Imagine standing by the shore, planting barley, and hearing a thunder that doesn't stop. Then a wall of water arrives, not overnight, but not slowly enough for escape. If true, this might have seeded 1,000 flood myths, but no writing survived to say so. The memory may only exist in the stories we later called sacred, and if it's not true, the idea still reveals something important: how deeply we crave origin stories to explain the cracks in the past. Why do so many civilizations have flood myths? Is it because they all suffered the same event? Or is it because water is the great leveler, and in its wake, the mind must build something to hold on to? That brings us back to the question we began with. What was lost in the flood? The answer is almost everything and almost nothing. What was truly lost may not have been cities or names or records, but perspective. The flood wiped out more than knowledge. It erased context. Without context, we misunderstand even what survives. A clay tablet with no reference point becomes myth. A buried wall becomes rumor. A vanished city becomes Atlantis. So the real flood, the flood beneath all floods, was Pre-Anese, the slow drowning of ordinary meaning. And in that silence, the world began again. But what if it didn't begin again in every place? What if, in some buried plain or sunken estuary, a city still sleeps, its walls intact beneath the silt? What if a warehouse of scrolls, wrapped in oilskin, lies under the mud of a forgotten delta, its language unknown, but its truth still dry? Would we know it if we found it, or would we mistake it for something too ordinary to matter? And in that quiet question lies the real flood, the one still rising. The waters always leave something behind, not just destruction, not just silence, but relics, traces, a new canvas where the old has been scrubbed nearly clean, yet not entirely. No flood is perfect. No forgetting is ever complete. You and I now stand at the edge of the retreating tide, looking not for survivors, but for echoes. What remains after a flood is not just sediment. It is uncertainty. It is the pause between generations when elders can no longer point to the sacred hill because the hill is gone. When temples once mapped to the stars vanish beneath clay. When names are spoken without meaning and children grow up in landscapes that no longer match the myths, but still capable endure. Let's walk through what's left. Begin in Mesopotamia, in the muddy ruins of yore, not the grand ziggurat, but the lower city. Streets once swept daily are caked in centuries of earth. A child's toy lies buried beside a foundation, a bead, a shard of a drinking vessel. A wall where someone marked their height year after year, until the water made that measurement meaningless. Nearby, in the same city, someone rebuilt, not grandly, but carefully. Mud brick atop mud brick, no time for monuments, only shelter. The new generation did not write down what was lost. They planted barley, repaired a canal, started again, and in doing so, buried memory beneath survival. In Egypt, the Nile flooded yearly. It was a gift, not a curse, but even gifts can take. One year, the flood was too strong. Another, it didn't come at all. A priest recorded it not in panic, but in bureaucracy. The harvest was poor, grain was stored, taxes were adjusted. Yet the implication was clear. The river was slipping out of rhythm. The calendar, so proudly kept, was beginning to lie. You see, the ancients believed the world must remain in balance. Floods had their place, just enough to renew the soil, not enough to erase the village. When the water forgot the script, it was a role of kings and priests to restore the order, to perform rituals, to interpret omens. But behind every ritual was fear. Fear that the order was gone for good. Now, step farther east to the Yellow River in ancient China. Known both as the cradle of civilization and China's sorrow, it changed course dozens of times in recorded history. Entire cities vanished not from conquest, but from sediment and redirection. The flood was not an event, but a process of long war against geography. Dynasties rose not just on military power, but on flood control. To tame the river was to earn the mandate of heaven. But who remembered the towns that lost that war? Songs preserved the names of the farmers who watched the river climb through their windows. Can then watched their homes dissolve into the current. Yet their resilience is written in terraces, in canals, in dry stone walls, rebuilt with silent hands. In Mesoamerica, the ancient Maya endured floods, not of water, but of collapse. Drought, followed by sudden rains. Crops failed, cities emptied. Lowland centers that had thrived for centuries were swallowed by jungle. When the Spanish arrived centuries later, they asked the Maya who had built the Great Pyramids. Many had forgotten. Others claimed they had always been there. When memory drowns, myth is the raft. Sometimes what floods is not land, but language. Consider the case of linear Aeon undeciphered script used by the Minoans of Crete, a civilization deeply tied to the sea. We have their tablets, we have their frescoes, their tools, their jewelry, but the key to their tongue is missing. It was lost perhaps in volcanic eruption, perhaps in economic collapse, perhaps in flood. So, though their buildings remain, we do not hear their voices. And what of the Dogalan people? Now we turn to the North Sea, a place that was once not sea at all. Between 10,000 and 6,000 BCE, what is now the ocean between Britain and continental Europe was dry land. Rivers braided through forests. Hunters tracked red deer across wetlands. Families built camps, made tools, buried their dead. It was a world known only to them. Then the waters rose. Slowly, at first, a few inches each year, but steadily. Eventually, a tsunami triggered by the Storegga slide, an undersea landslide off the coast of Norway, rushed in and drowned the final parts. By 5000 BCE, Doggerland was gone. No ruins remain. No books, but fishermen sometimes pull up carved antlers from the seabed, and sonar reveals ancient riverbeds still winding beneath the waves. It is one of the greatest vanishings in European prehistory. And still, we ask, what stories were told on those vanished shores? What lullabies were sung in languages no longer spoken? Did they speak of the rising water? Did they know they were being erased? It's tempting to think of flood myths as exaggerations passed down through oral traditions, but perhaps they're not exaggerations at all. Perhaps they're precise memories stretched across generations like fishing nets, catching fragments of a truth too large to carry whole. Even today, we find clues in Turkey's Black Sea region. Divers have discovered traces of ancient shorelines far beneath the waves. In India's Gulf of Kamhat, Sonar scans suggest the outline of structures long submerged, though debate continues. Along the American coasts, native oral traditions describe rising waters and lost lands passed down for millennia. These are not just stories, they are maps, not of geography, but of memory. You might wonder, why do we keep returning to these lost cities, these drowned valleys? Because, in a way, they are still with us. Their bones lie beneath ours. Their myths, half forgotten, still shape the way we tell time, the way we fear disaster, the way we treat rivers as sacred and unpredictable. Floods did not just wipe things away. They created a template, and every ancient culture, rebirth follows. Deluge. Civilization emerges, not in calm times, but in recovery. After the water, we build temples, we organize, we record, we invent writing, not for beauty, but for grain, because the harvest must be tracked, because the river cannot be trusted. And in doing so, we build civilizations on silt. So much of what we call history is actually reconstruction, guesses, partial truths, the wet edge of memory. Imagine what we've missed. Entire cities without stone, built of timber and clay, washed away completely. Languages never written, songs never recorded, gods who were worshipped only for a season. Imagine the names never carved into monuments. The flood does not care for hierarchies. It drowns kings and farmers alike. And imagine what lies beneath our feet now in every delta, every dried lake bed, every buried estuary. There may still rest a tablet, a wheel, a jar, a skeleton curled in the fetal position, a question waiting to be asked again. We have always tried to defeat forgetting. We build museums, we digitize, we carve stone, we launch golden records into space. But perhaps the deeper truth is this: the flood always comes, sometimes in water, sometimes in war, sometimes in time itself. What matters is not what survives the flood, but how we listen to what remains. The mud may bury the past, but it also preserves it, compressed, layered, sealed in darkness. One day, perhaps 1,000 years from now, someone may dig through the silt of our time, and they will wonder what we feared, what we saved, what we left behind, not in monuments, but in patterns, how we built, how we broke, how we began again. And they may ask the same question we ask now: what was lost in the flood before history began? And the answer will be the same: more than we will ever know. But not everything, not yet, not yet. They say the sea keeps secrets better than the earth ever could. And nowhere is this more hauntingly true than beneath the shallow, silty waters of the Persian Gulf, between the ancient mouths of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and the craggy shores of Iran, Bahrain, and Oman, lies a stretch of ocean that, for thousands of years, was not ocean at all. Today, it is sea, shimmering and flat, a quiet corridor of trade and modern oil. But in the deep silence beneath the Gulf's floor, in sediment layered by millennia, there are hints of a vanished land, a green corridor that once stretched between continents, a cradle, perhaps, for the stories that would become civilization. And you, calmly listening now, eyes soft, maybe half closed, are about to visit a land erased before the first tablets were carved in Sumer, before the first cities crowned the Fertile Crescent. This is the story of the Gulf Oasis, a place that might have been the missing chapter between prehistory and history, if only it hadn't drowned. Let's begin at the edge. During the last ice age, sea levels were lower, vastly lower by nearly 120 meters. What is now the Persian Gulf was then a wide, flat valley cut with braided rivers, fed by rainfall from distant highlands. The Tigris and Euphrates didn't empty into a salt bay. They wound through a vast alluvial plain, perhaps merging with rivers now long forgotten. Archaeologists, geologists, and remote sensing researchers have quietly suspected it for years. not based on myth, but on the peculiar geography. Sonar scans reveal an odd shape, a submerged, delta-like landscape. Ancient riverbeds snaked across the seafloor, paleocanals, fossilized rivers. There are places where no coral grows, as though something still lies beneath. It was once a land where people could live. Not just wander or hunt, but truly live, planting, gathering, herding. Place where early agriculture could have quietly taken root, where nomads might have lingered just long enough to become villagers. But the water came, not all at once. Not in a flood or a cataclysm, but slowly, predictably, relentlessly. As the ice age melted and sea levels rose, the Gulf filled like a bowl, inch by inch, century by century. The river valleys were submerged. First the marshes, then the farms, then the hearths and huts. No towering stone walls marked their places. No temples tall enough to be spared. Only silence. And yet, something remains. Along the margins of the Arabian Peninsula, in the vast deserts that now seem empty, we find the clues. Sudden concentration of Neolithic settlements huddled along the edges of the modern Gulf. Hundreds of sites, flint tools, shell middens, burial cairns, and the timing, always the same. Just after the sea swallowed the lowlands, it's as though a wave of people was pushed outward. Refugees from a land we no longer see. They didn't disappear. They moved up, out, inland, carrying with them their tools, their animals, their memories. You might be wondering, why haven't we found this sunken city? Why no walls? Why no ruins? 'Cause what we call civilization, cities, roads, monuments, came later, much later. These were not builders of temples, okay? They were builders of homes. Their houses were mud and red, okay? Their boundaries were marked with stones and woven fences, okay? And the sea takes those gently. No trace remains. But perhaps we have been asking the wrong question. The Gulf oasis may not have been a single lost city. It may have been a whole region, a land larger than Mesopotamia itself, where cultures thrived for thousands of years in anonymity. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the place where languages began to split, where early words drifted apart like tectonic plates. Some flowed toward Sumer, others south toward Oman, still others west to the deserts of Arabia. You might even say this was the seed bed of myth, because the people who fled this disappearing land carried stories with them of a paradise crowned, of a green world lost to water, of a time when animals and people lived close to the land before it all changed. In southern Mesopotamia, the oldest Sumerian texts speak of a place to the south, the land of Dilmun. It was not a vague realm of gods. It was described with real detail, a place of clear water, abundant dates, no disease, and no death. In some texts, it is where the gods first walked. In others, it is the source of life itself. Was Dilmun myth? Was it Bahrain? Was it memory? Or was it a fading echo of the Gulf oasis, a recollection passed down orally, reshaped by poets, but rooted in something real? Later, in Islamic tradition, tales speak of Iram of the Pillars, a city so grand it defied God, so it was buried beneath sand. In Arabian legend, the city of Uber vanishes in a single night. In Sumerian stories, the god Enki dwells beneath the freshwater abyss. And what are all these, if not echoes? You may recall the biblical Garden of Eden. Its location has long been debated, but among some scholars, one idea has persisted quietly, that Eden, with its 4 rivers and lush life, lay at the heart of what is now the Persian Gulf basin, not a literal garden, but a memory, a place where something vital was lost, not because of sin, not because of fire or war, but because the sea rose, and history, as we know it, forgot to write it down. You see, the great irony is this: The people who lived in the Gulf oasis may have been among the first to try settling, farming, domesticating, but because they lived before writing, and because their world was flooded, they left no record. Their legacy lives only in the margins, in scattered sites along the Gulf, in pottery styles that seem to leap across the desert, in genetic studies hinting at ancient migrations, in myths too persistent to dismiss. The Gulf today seems featureless, but beneath its waters, layers of sediment hold the truth. Every few meters, a shift in soil tells of a vanished river, a flood, a drought, a movement of people. The problem is not that we don't know the story. The problem is that the sea is hard to read. Archaeologists are working on it, using sonar, coring drills, geochemical analysis, but it is slow. The Gulf's waters are murky. Politics and modern development complicate underwater exploration, and time always works against clarity. Still, the idea remains tantalizing that the story of civilization might need a preface, that before Eridu, before Uruk, before even the oldest temples of southern Iraq, there was a chapter beneath the sea. A chapter not erased, but simply wet, sealed, waiting. As you drift now, listening gently, consider this. We define civilization by its monuments, cities, its scripts, but perhaps what really matters is what gets carried forward. A tool design, a seed variety, a melody sung to a child. These two are history, and when people flee a vanishing homeland, they don't take pillars, they take memory. So the Gulf oasis is not entirely gone. It lives in the margins of our maps, in the patterns of early settlement, in the dreams of those who shaped the first empires. It lives in the idea that something came before, something quiet, something green, something drowned. And now, as we end this section, one question remains. If the Persian Gulf was once the cradle of forgotten ancestors, what more still sleeps beneath its waves, buried in silt and shadow, waiting for the day the waters speak? The idea that the Persian Gulf once cradled a lost civilization is no longer the fantasy of poets or speculative cartographers. In recent decades, science, slow, methodical, and dull in all the best ways, has begun to trace the outlines of what may have once existed beneath its waters. But the process is not simple, nor is it swift. It's archaeology in reverse, not digging downward into soil, but scanning outward into salt water and sediment. The past, it turns out, is not only buried, it's flooded. To understand this forgotten chapter, we begin with mud, and maps. You see, long before aerial drones and laser scans, the only clues to prehistory came from the ground. Cores of sediment drilled deep beneath the seafloor have revealed ancient soil types that do not match current underwater environments. Layers of fine silt suggest former riverbanks. Shell beds show shifts from freshwater to brackish to marine environments over time. The progression tells a story. Once dry land, then swamp, then estuary, then sea. Remote sensing technology helped sharpen the picture. Satellite imagery, when filtered through software and adjusted for geological time, revealed submerged riverbeds stretching across the seabed, now hundreds of kilometers from any coastline. These paleocanals, as they're called, do not form randomly. They tell of rivers that once flowed, carrying sediment and water from now distant highlands. Some may have carried the runoff of ancient glaciers. Others float gently through flat grasslands, carving paths between wetlands and low hills. And where there are rivers, there are people. Archaeologists began asking a strange but rational question. If humans spread across the globe by following rivers and coastlines, then why would they not have settled in this fertile basin when it was land? Why should the Persian Gulf, in its dry phase, be an exception? The answer, of course, is that it wasn't. What is now the floor of the Gulf may once have been the busiest corridor of human movement between the Levant, Mesopotamia, South Asia, and the Horn of Africa. Some even believe this may have been the missing link, a green region where early groups merged, split, or developed separately before migrating out. What's especially striking is the archaeological halo effect surrounding the Gulf. On the eastern coast of Saudi Arabia, inland from today's sea, clusters of Neolithic and pre-Neolithic sites appear, like a fringe around an invisible center. The densest clusters form along what would have been the prehistoric shoreline of this vanished valley. That shoreline, now submerged, is likely where many of the early people of the region lived. The ancient tools they left behind, bladelets, arrowheads, bone needles, are not dramatically different from those found in parts of the Indus or ancient Iran, but their sudden appearance in large numbers, at the Gulf's modern edges suggests a mass displacement. The waters rose gradually, yes, but for those living on the lowlands, it may have still felt like a creeping doom. One season, the river shifted. The next, it overflowed. Within a few generations, what was once a productive marshland turned into saline flats. Then, silence. We tend to imagine floods as catastrophic, a sudden breaking of a dam, a rushing wall of water. But this was not such a story. The sea didn't come in an hour, came in inches. Every year, the shoreline moved inland. A child born near the river's bend would, by adulthood, have to walk half a day's distance to find that bend again, now swallowed by brackish tides. This slow loss has a psychological weight. It presses, year after year, in the background. It gives rise to longing, to myth, and to stories that seek to preserve what's gone, even when it can no longer be touched. The people who once called this valley home likely adapted as best they could. Some would have followed the receding shoreline, always keeping to the edge of the marsh. Others would have turned inland, settling on higher plateaus. Those migrations form part of the origin stories of Arabian and Mesopotamian cultures. Though most of these oral histories are long lost, still, their shadows remain. There's an old tale from the Sumerians of a man who wanders from a land called the place where the rivers meet the sea, searching for a home after the waters rise. He crosses mountains, deserts, and finds a woman who teaches him how to live off dates and goats. The story, in its fragmented cuneiform form, sounds mundane, but when placed within this geographical context, it becomes more than myth. It reads like memory. Modern scholars have tried giving this ghostly land a name. The Gulf Oasis is the most common. Some suggest Dilmun, borrowing from Sumerian epics. Others leave it unnamed, an implied homeland behind the silence. And yet, silence does not mean emptiness. Beneath the Gulf lie dozens of potential archaeological sites. Ground-penetrating radar and acoustic sub-bottom profiling have revealed uneven features, small mounds, patterns inconsistent with mere geology. Some suggest former settlements or natural levees that early humans may have used for seasonal living. The difficulty, of course, is excavation. You can't dig underwater the same way you dig on land. Everything is slower, visibility is poor, politics are harder. Much of the Gulf is claimed by oil interests. Every square meter of seafloor may also be a pipeline corridor or a shipping route, and yet, the interest persists. A few test excavations carried out with extreme care have found artifacts embedded in underwater sediments that carbon date to between 8,000 and 6,000 BCE. This is precisely when the sea levels were climbing its fastest. It matches the story, but the most compelling evidence is the pattern. On the edges of the Gulf, we find settlements that emerge suddenly with no apparent precursors. People appear on the Omani coast with advanced fishing tools, net weights, and fire pits, but no signs of gradual development in the region. In Qatar and Bahrain, complex shell middens appear, suggesting long-term habitation. Yet, the older layers are absent. It's as if people brought their culture with them, whole from somewhere else, a place now underwater. And so we begin to understand the Gulf not as a void, but as a corridor of movement and loss. It served as a land bridge between continents, a mixing bowl, cradle, and then it was gone. The cultures that fled did not vanish. They seeded new worlds. Some may have influenced early Mesopotamian agriculture. Others, perhaps, crossed to what would later become the Harappan zone in western India. Still others may have moved into the deserts of Central Arabia, carrying with them the last memory of green fields and gentle water. The Gulf today appears empty, but emptiness is an illusion. It is full of silt, of salt, and of sleep. If you were to dive today beneath its waves, you would find only mud, shells, tiny fish, perhaps the skeleton of a dhow. Nothing else. The past is deeper, but in the right light, if you knew where to look, you might find a line of stones, once part of a hearth. You might see charcoal flecks, still embedded in clay, the remains of a meal eaten 9,000 years ago. You might feel, more than see, the faint presence of lives that shaped the world and drifted into legend. We often forget that history is not just what survives, it is also what is lost. And the Persian Gulf, this quiet way, holds more loss than most. As you drift now, gently, consider this. We spend so much time tracing the ruins of cities that we forget to ask, what was there before the cities? Not palaces, but pathways. Not gods, but gardens. Not history, but memory. And the Gulf, wide, warm, flat, remains one of the greatest libraries never opened. One more section remains in this story, and a quiet question lingers still. We one day drain the silt and read the stone beneath. What forgotten words might we recover from the drowned valleys of the Gulf? You might be wondering, why does it matter? Why bother investigating a landscape that now lies buried beneath hundreds of meters of salt water and sediment? Why dedicate resources to probing the muddy seabed of the Persian Gulf when we already have Egypt's tombs, Mesopotamia's cigarettes, and the cities of the Indus? Because what lies beneath the Gulf is not just another ruined temple or a forgotten king's name. It may be the missing bridge, the key that explains the leap from small, scattered Neolithic communities to the sudden appearance of complex urban civilizations. Historians and archaeologists, twice, have long puzzled over how early human societies transitioned so rapidly, almost suspiciously rapidly, from small bands of foragers to city builders, astronomers, and canal makers. These leaps happen in only a few millennia, and in some places, like southern Mesopotamia, with no clear precursors in Iraq. For instance, the Ubaid culture appeared out of nowhere. Around 6500 BCE, they began building planned villages, with rectangular houses, tools of fired clay, communal storage areas, and early signs of social stratification. But from where? Where were the earlier layers that show how they learned these things? The pattern repeats, suddenly advanced, with no obvious origin nearby. This is where the Gulf comes in. Before it was a sea, the basin of the Persian Gulf was a vast lowland, a fertile plain fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and Wadi Batin rivers. The climate was milder than rainfall from the Zagros Mountains to the east and the Anatolian Plateau to the north filled these rivers with meltwater. The basin caught all of it. The flatness of the land meant that the rivers didn't carve deep valleys. Instead, they meandered slowly, creating wide, marshy floodplains. These were ideal conditions for early humans: abundant, fresh water, edible plants, migratory birds, and fish-rich channels. Think of the marshes of southern Iraq today, what extended out for hundreds of kilometers into what is now ocean. That's the kind of world we're talking about. People could have lived in that basin for thousands of years, tilling complex systems of irrigation, storytelling, agriculture, and tool-making, all without leaving traces where we're used to looking. And when the sea finally crept in, steadily, cruelly, relentlessly, they would have packed up and moved. Not all at once, but in waves. Slow migration, forced not by famine or war, but by rising water and lost ground. They would have carried their knowledge with them: how to build rectangular homes, how to divide land, how to store grain and divert water, how to measure time by the stars. What we call a sudden appearance of complexity in Mesopotamia may simply be the reappearance of skills learned somewhere else, somewhere now underwater. This isn't just speculation. Several archaeological sites on the eastern and southern rims of the Gulf, including in present-day Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and eastern Saudi Arabia, show patterns that suggest they were not the first settlements of their kind. Rather, they look like the work of people who already knew what they were doing. These weren't experiments, they were adaptations. Consider Bahrain, known in ancient texts as Dilmun. Tinian mythology. Dilmun was a land of origins, a place of purity and trade. It was where the gods met and where fresh waters bubbled up. But the earliest physical traces of Dilmun culture on Bahrain date to around 3000 BCE, and again, they seem already advanced. So where were the earlier layers? They may have been erased by the sea. Even ancient Mesopotamian scribes speak of lands that once existed and were swallowed, places where the fresh waters met the bitter, where temples once stood, but now fish swim. It's easy to dismiss such lines as poetry, but poetry often preserves what memory forgets. In geological terms, the Gulf flooded quickly. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose more than 100 meters globally. Between 12,000 and 6,000 BCE, the Gulf transformed from a fertile inland basin into the marine body we know today. Most of the flooding occurred between 8,000 and 6,000 BCE, exactly the time when we see increased settlement pressure on Mesopotamia's southern fringe. Satellite imaging confirms the presence of ancient riverbeds on the Gulf floor, some remarkably straight, suggesting possible canal work. Other features look like the remains of raised bankments or settlements built on levees, but verifying these hints is extraordinarily difficult. You can't just walk out and dig. Diving in the Gulf means limited visibility, strong currents, and silt that settles over everything like wet snow. Moreover, most of the region is politically sensitive. Oil pipelines crisscross the seabed, making excavation both dangerous and diplomatically delicate. Yet slowly, and with growing interest, researchers are trying. Marine geologists have extracted sediment cores showing layers of organic material, inconsistent with modern marine life, suggesting ancient terrestrial vegetation. Pollen analysis reveals that the basin once supported grasses, date palms, reeds, and even some types of wheat like grains, all signs of human cultivation. And where there is cultivation, there is planning and memory, and perhaps even writing. Could this vanished plain beneath the Gulf be the site of the world's first forgotten texts? Not in cuneiform or hieroglyph, but in etched stone or bark, or patterns of settlement that carried meaning. We may never know, but the possibility alone is enough to keep scholars searching. And then there's the silence. Perhaps the most haunting part. The people who lived in the basin left no known legends, no epics, no names. Their culture, whatever it was, became substrate for those who came after. Their rivers were renamed, their gods forgotten, their homes washed clean, but their echoes remain in the way the Ubaid people designed their cities, taught in the myths of Dilmun and the land beyond the sea, and the persistent idea, found from India to Iraq, of a flood that erased the world but spared a remnant, a single family, a lone boat, a final seed. Myth is not always history, but it is not always invention either. It is a mirror, warped, cracked, but still reflecting. If the basin was once full of life, then its drowning would have been the greatest trauma imaginable for those early peoples. And trauma echoes. It takes root in stories, in cautionary tales, in prayers. So, what was lost. Not just homes, but languages, maps, songs, a worldview shaped by reeds and water, stars and tides. Perhaps the idea of paradise, of a perfect land now gone, comes not from the imagination, but from memory, the kind passed from mother to child, fading with each telling. We do not know what was written in that land, but we know what was not. No grave markers remain, no names of kings, no border treaties, only soft sediment lined with traces of life. Turtle shell, a flint blade, a worn fishhook. Small, ordinary things. But you see, that is what makes it all so powerful, because history, real history, is not built on wars and crowns. It is built on how people lived, what they carried, how they adapted when the world changed and did not wait for them. The Gulf was not just a drowned land, it was a crucible. And today, silence still shapes us. We build cities at the edges of rising seas. We write stories about lost Edens. We dream of lands beneath the water, not out of fantasy, okay, but from an instinct older than writing. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, think not of what we know, but of what we've forgotten, not of the ruins we can photograph, but of the gardens we can only guess, and let the slow, salt-filled silence of the Persian Gulf cradle your thoughts like a tide that never truly recedes. What else might we have carried from that vanished valley unknowingly into every civilization that came after? And what secrets are still buried there, waiting, before it became the largest hot desert on earth, a vast expanse of dust, rock, and silence, stretching from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. The Sahara was alive, not metaphorically, not in some distant myth, but truly, vibrantly alive. You might be surprised to know that as recently as 10,000 years ago, vast swaths of what we now call desert were filled with lakes so large they dwarfed some European countries. Grasses that stretched across the horizon, and trees that formed green canopies, beneath which early humans fished, herded, and even painted. You wouldn't recognize the Sahara then. There were giraffes walking through acacia groves. There were hippopotamuses wallowing in freshwater basins. There were birds that now call the jungles of West Africa home, migrating and nesting here. Elephants once carved trails through these greener lands, and at night, hyenas laughed and lions prowled, not in search of shade, but waterholes, and people lived here too, not at the edge of survival, but in relative abundance. They painted their world on the walls of shallow caves and rocky shelters, drawing boats, cattle, dancers, and long lines of travelers. Their images, frozen in ochre and white pigment, still cling to the rocks of places like the Tassili Najir in Algeria and the Gilf Khyber in Egypt, mute testimony to a Sahara that no longer exists. This period is called the African Humid Period, and it began around 14,500 years ago, slowly transforming the desert into a grassland savanna. Driven by changes in Earth's orbit and axial tilt, the monsoon rains moved northward, bringing water where there had been drought for millennia. What followed was one of the most sustained greening episodes in human history. Lakes formed, not puddles, but seas. Take Lake Megachad, for example. In its prime, this ancient lake covered over 400,000 square kilometers. That's more than twice the size of the modern Caspian Sea. At its largest extent, Lake Megachad spanned across parts of modern-day Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. Villagers today walk across sand dunes, unaware that their ancestors once lived on islands, fished from canoes, and traced the shorelines of a freshwater giant. And Lake Megachad wasn't alone. The Sahara was pockmarked with water bodies. Lake Fezzan in Libya, Lake Annette in Algeria, and countless smaller basins that supported grasses, reeds, fish, and life. Archaeologists have uncovered fishhooks carved from bone, grindstones used to process wild grains, and even pottery fragments, some of the oldest known ceramics in Africa buried beneath layers of wind-blown dust. And yet, these lakes are gone now. The water vanished, not with one cataclysm, but slowly, with the whisper of a shifting climate. Around 5500 BCE, rainfall patterns began to retreat southward. The monsoons weakened. The skies changed color. Storms became rare. And each year, the lakes shrank just a little more. But it wasn't uniform. Some regions dried out faster than others. In some places, people adapted by digging wells or moving to higher elevations where seasonal rain still pooled. Others followed retreating watercourses, becoming the first nomads of what would become one of Earth's harshest terrains. Still, the drying continued. Lake Megachad broke into smaller parts, first into 3, then 2, then just a shallow patch, known today as Lake Chad. And even that, one of the last remnants of a green Sahara, had shrunk by over 90% in the past century alone. Today, you can stand in the middle of a dune sea and pick up a snail shell, bleached by the sun, or the remains of a fish bone, far from any water source. You can walk ancient shorelines etched in stone, now high and dry, and feel the wind carving new paths, where once water lapped at the edges of red boats. But what's even more haunting is the art, because the people who lived during the Green Sahara didn't just survive. They recorded on rock walls in places like the Inadi Plateau and the Caucasus Mountains. There are drawings of cattle herders, men and women, walking alongside bulls with long horns and elaborate markings. Some cattle are shown with what appear to be pens or fenced enclosures, suggesting an early form of animal husbandry, long before such practices took hold in Egypt or the Levant. There are boats, too long, thin vessels with paddles and raised ends, boats drawn hundreds of miles from the nearest water today, floating in a sea that no longer exists. There are dancers in lines, hands joined, moving in procession. Was it ritual, celebration, a memory of better days? We can't know, but there's something intimate about these images. They're not depictions of war or conquest. They show life as it was, slow, seasonal, rhythmic. A mother holding a child, a group fishing, a man riding what might be an early domesticated ox. Some images are even carved deeply as if meant to last, and in a way, they have far longer than any building or empire. But this Green Sahara was not to last. As the lakes vanished, so did the people. Some moved eastward, toward the Nile. Others wandered south, urging into communities along the Sahel, and others simply disappeared from the record, swallowed not by war or fire, but by the slow, patient silence of drying earth. We tend to think of deserts as eternal, but they're not. They shift, they move, they rise from floodplains and fall back into sea. In the Sahara, vast, dry, and lifeless, is younger than you think. Only 5,000 years ago, it was still dotted with trees and lakes. And only 2,000 years before that, it was the heart of a civilization that has no name, no central monument, no written language, no temples of stone, just art on walls, bones in sand, and lakes that left no skeletons behind, only basins, invisible from above unless you know how to look. And so we return to the question, what was lost? Not just water, but memory. Not just artifacts, but ways of life. If the people of the Green Sahara had survived longer, might they have shaped later civilizations more directly? Might their pottery styles have migrated into Egypt? Might their early pastoral systems have influenced the rise of Nubian kingdoms? We can speculate, but we can't know. All we can do is look at what remains, the outlines of ancient lakes, seen only from satellite images, the faded red of painted cattle, the sound of wind scraping across what was once a shoreline. It's a reminder that what we see today is not the whole story, that the desert is not a final state, but a phase, and that beneath every dry plain may lie a forgotten lake and a forgotten people waiting, not to return, but to be remembered. You're standing now in the heart of the Turner Desert, one of the most forbidding places on the planet. The sun blisters down, not a drop of water in sight. No bird song, no rustle of leaves, just wind, just sand, just silence. But 10,000 years ago, right where your feet press into powdery dust, this place echoed with the lowing of cattle and the voices of children. The ground you stand on once formed the southern shoreline of a lake larger than Lake Victoria. And while your eyes may find nothing but desolation, the ground remembers. That is the curious thing about landscapes. They store memory, they bury, preserve, and eventually reveal. And in the Sahara, as it transformed from a lush, green expanse into a world of dunes and dryness, it didn't erase its past. It simply folded it beneath the sand. In recent decades, scientists have begun peeling back those layers. It often begins with a satellite image, strange circular outlines in northern Niger, or unexpected color patterns near ancient escarpments. To the untrained eye, they mean nothing, but to paleoclimatologists and archaeologists, these are signatures, traces of ghost lakes, rippled shorelines, buried under millennia of dust, paths carved not by feet, but by receding water. And so, they, ghost scientists and researchers, often guided by nomads who remember tales passed down for generations. The Tuareg especially have long spoken of ancient water, of seas of the ancestors. Many of these stories were dismissed for decades. Now, satellite confirmation and ground surveys suggest they were always rooted in truth. One of the most extraordinary discoveries came from the Bodily Depression in Chad today. It is one of the dustiest places on Earth. The winds that sweep through here carry billions of tons of fine particles across the Atlantic to fertilize the Amazon basin. A strange biological link between Africa's past and South America's present. But in the early Holocene, this was the deepest point of Lake Megachad. At its height, this depression lay underwater, a thriving aquatic zone. And as the lake shrank, it left behind a silt bed rich with the remains of freshwater organisms, diatoms, mollusks, tiny aquatic insects. The dust that now fuels one of the world's largest rainforests was once the floor of a green Sahara's greatest lake. It's a poetic reversal, life begetting life across continents. But the lakes left more than dust. They left clues in the Central Sahara, especially in the region of the Inidi Plateau in Chad and the Caucasus Mountains in Libya. Archaeologists have uncovered rock shelters filled with pottery fragments. Some of these vessels are remarkably advanced, with decorative patterns and complex construction techniques. They predate the invention of the potter's wheel, and they tell a story, not of desperation, but of experimentation, of people who had time, space, and security to make things that were not strictly necessary for survival. To shape clay into bowls, jars, and storage vessels, to decorate them, sometimes with geometric motifs, sometimes with impressions of woven fabrics or basketry. In places like Uin Mahagig in southwestern Libya, even mummified remains have been found. The most famous is that of a young child, around 2 years old, carefully buried in a fetal position and wrapped in animal skin. The preservation was remarkable, not because the climate was dry, but because the burial method was deliberate. The body was interred with care, with signs of ritual, of belief. This was a culture with memory, with mourning, with meaning, and perhaps most startling of all is the evidence of domestication. Before the Nile Valley's pharaonic dynasties, before Mesopotamia's ziggurats, the people of the Green Sahara were managing herds, cattle, primarily, rock art shows, them prominently, often central to scenes attended by human figures. Sometimes they're shown drinking from troughs or being milked. Some even wear harnesses or what appeared to be decorative garlands. This art isn't chaotic. It's organized, repetitive, intentional. There's debate among scholars about how far this domestication went, whether these early Saharans developed pastoralism independently or adopted it from contact with communities further south. But the consensus is clear. This was one of the earliest cradles of animal management on the continent. And when the rains began to fail, these skills traveled. Some followed the retreating monsoons southward toward what is now Mali, Niger, and northern Nigeria. Others moved east toward the Nile, bringing with them not just animals, but knowledge. There is compelling evidence that the roots of Egyptian civilization were seeded not along the Mediterranean, but by migrations from the drying Sahara. As their world desiccated, Saharan herders and artisans drifted toward more fertile lands, merging with river-based communities and reshaping the cultural map of North Africa. This wasn't an invasion. It wasn't conquest. It was flow, gradual, invisible, like the retreat of a lake or the spreading of dust. The Sahara didn't just dry out. It exported culture, ideas, people. It's hard to picture now. When we think of deserts, we imagine stasis, eternal stillness. But the Sahara has always been in motion, not just in wind and sand, but in human experience. And while some of its lakes vanished entirely, others lingered. There's one story, it's passed down through generations, about a lake that fought extinction longer than the rest. A small body of water tucked in a depression near the Tibesti Mountains. Local tribes call it the Eye of the Sahara, though that name is sometimes applied to other features too. Even as the rains retreated, this lake, fed by underground springs, held on, and it became a gathering point, a place where migrating groups paused, traded, shared stories, left behind fragments of pots and bones, perhaps even myths, because in time, these shrinking lakes became sacred. You see, when water becomes rare, it gains meaning, and when a lake that once stretched beyond the horizon becomes a puddle, its shores take on the weight of memory. Children are told tales of its vastness. Elders speak of fish that no longer swim there. The very shape of the shoreline becomes legend, a story, written in topography. Some researchers believe this reverence helped inspire the idea of sacred rivers and lakes in later African cultures, that the Nile's holiness or the importance of rain deities in West African tradition. Kara traces its roots not just to environment, but to memory, to a time when water was not taken for granted, when the Sahara was not a wall, but a bridge, when lakes were not exceptions, but the rule. It's a difficult thing to grasp, this inversion of expectation. But it's important, because if the Sahara was once green, then our understanding of Africa's past, and by extension, human history, must be revised. This wasn't an empty land waiting to be crossed. It was a home, a teacher, a cradle dot, and though the lakes are gone, they still shape us in the dust that feeds the rainforest and the DNA of herders in East Africa, in the stories whispered at firelight by people who don't remember the lakes themselves, but carry the echo of their loss. In that way, the Sahara hasn't forgotten. It has simply learned to be silent, be silent. It did not happen in a day. The death of the Sahara's lakes came slowly, so slowly that no single generation would have called it a collapse. It crept in on the edges. A few dry seasons, a shift in the wind, a change in the grass, a watering hole that didn't refill, a pond that turned brackish, then brown, then bone dry. Imagine being one of the last children born beside a lake that no longer had a name, only a shape in the memories of your parents. You would have heard their stories of boats, of fish traps, of water birds that nested in the reeds, but you would not have seen them. You would have heard of thunderstorms that came in sheets and of nights filled with frog song. But your own nights would have been still and dry. And when the day came to leave, to move away from the familiar basin into harsher, unfamiliar ground, you would not have known you were part of an epical migration. You would have simply been hungry, tired, confused, following the herds, the rain, or your elders, leaving behind not ruins, but absence. That is one of the most haunting things about the Green Sahara. It left so little behind. Unlike Mesopotamia, with its ziggurats and clay tablets, Egypt, with its temples and tombs. The early cultures of the Saharan lakes were made mostly of what could not endure: leather, wood, spoken words, memory. And so, for thousands of years, their stories were buried not under stone, but under sand. It's taken satellites, deep buried ceramics, and rock paintings to find their traces. But traces remain in the caves of Tassili Najar in southeastern Algeria. Hundreds of paintings tell of this transformation, not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow shift. In the oldest layers, there are elephants, giraffes, hippos, and crocodiles, creatures of water and grassland, herds of cattle, too, led by men with bows or staffs, sometimes shown dancing. These early scenes, painted with ochre, charcoal, and blood, are alive with motion. There is joy, there is abundance, and then, gradually, the animals change. The rivers disappear. The humans depicted began to wear different clothing, longer robes, head coverings, perhaps a sign of the heat. The cattle are fewer. The pose is more static. Eventually, the art becomes geometric, abstract, perhaps spiritual, perhaps simply tired by the final layers. There are camels, animals not introduced to the Sahara until around 500 CE. They're shown walking in caravans. Riders sit astride them, and in some images, they pass near what may be ruins or shrines, or simply broken stones. The art ends, but not because people disappeared entirely. Rather, the desert grew silent in a new way. Populations grew sparse. Some became nomads. Others drifted to oases, or southward into the Sahel. A few found the Nile. And in these movements, something curious happened. The Sahara became not just a place to leave, but a memory to carry. You can see it in language. Many Afro-Asiatic languages, particularly in the Chadic group, contain words that seem to recall aquatic environments long vanished from their speakers' homelands. Some West African creation myths speak of a time when the land was water and the people walked with the animals. Even the Dogon of Mali, famous for their astronomy, retain ancestral stories of star spirits and floods, told beside cliffs that once overlooked ancient lakes. These are not myths invented from emptiness. They are memories adapted through time, cultural fossils of a world that truly was. And from these migrating peoples, new cultures were born in the Nile Valley. Communities that had once lived along Saharan lakes arrived with cattle herding traditions, knowledge of ceramic production, and a symbolic worldview shaped by water's disappearance. Scholars increasingly believe that the roots of ancient Egyptian religious ideas, the sacredness of rivers, the duality of desert and water, the concept of cyclical death and rebirth, emerged not just from Nile floods, but from the lived experience of watching a green land vanish. Consider that the earliest god associated with the underworld, Osiris, was not originally a sun god or a sky deity. He was associated with fertility, with agriculture, with the cycles of life and death. In early myths, he was buried in the earth, drowned in the Nile, reborn in the flood. The very structure of Egyptian religion may carry echoes of the Green Sahara's final days, the longing for what was lost, and the belief that life could return if the rains ever did. In this way, the lakes live on, not in water, but in worship, not in rivers, but in rivers of thought. And the question lingers, could it happen again? That question is not as far-fetched as it seems. The Sahara's greening was not a one-time anomaly. It's happened before. Key claimant records show multiple wet phases stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, tied to subtle shifts in Earth's orbit and axial tilt what scientists call Milankovitch cycles. When these cycles align to increase solar radiation over North Africa, the monsoons return, the desert blooms, and when they recede, the land dries again. By that logic, the Sahara will be green again, though perhaps not in our lifetimes. But humans have learned to shape the climate in other ways now. Our presence is no longer passive. We warm the atmosphere, shift rainfall patterns, cut forests, dam rivers. It's not the slow rhythm of the planet anymore, it's the impatient beat of civilization. Still, the past whispers to us from silt beds beneath the sand, from pottery fragments held in museum drawers, from cave walls that once echoed with song, and from the dust that rises from the bodily depression, crosses the Atlantic, and falls as nutrients into the heart of the Amazon. We live in a world still shaped by lakes, no longer exist, and perhaps the deeper truth is this: the Sahara was never truly dead. It changed, and in changing, it changed. So, the next time you hear the wind moan across an empty dune, remember that it carries more than sand. It carries stories, broken pots, buried bones. The idea of a boy who once filled a jar at dawn and walked home through tall grass. Of a woman who whispered songs into a baby's ear while cows waded into water that's now a mirage. And it asks, what will you remember when the water is gone? Gone. Close your eyes and imagine the map of the world, but not the one you know today. Let the continents breathe outward. Let the seas shrink back. Let the shallow shelves of the oceans reveal what they once were. Now, look again at Southeast Asia. You no longer see just Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. You see a vast and connected landmass, Sundaland, a drowned continent, now hidden beneath the blue of the Java Sea, the Gulf of Thailand, the Andaman waters. For most of human prehistory, this place was not sea, but land. It's wide, humid, green, home to rivers and valleys and thousands of species, now scattered across isolated islands. It connected what we now think of as separate nations, okay? And for tens of thousands of years, it was not exotic, it was ordinary. You walked across Sundaland the way one might walk across a continent. And that is where our story begins. Not with rising water, but with forgotten land. During the last ice age, especially around 26,000 to 20,000 years ago, vast amounts of the world's water were locked up in glaciers and ice sheets. Okay. This lowered sea levels by over 120 meters. Okay. And with the sea held back, the world's coastlines extended far beyond their modern boundaries in Southeast Asia. This meant that the islands of Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and mainland Indochina were connected. A single, sprawling landmass stretched from what is now Vietnam to Bali, from the edge of China to the northern tip of Australia. The South China Sea was largely dry. Okay. The Malacca Strait didn't exist. Okay. Singapore was not an island. It was inland. And this massive landmass, rich with freshwater rivers and dense rainforest, supported a network of ecosystems that scientists are only beginning to reconstruct. We call this place Sundaland. You might never have heard of it, but it shaped the movement of animals, the paths of early humans, and possibly even some of the oldest stories ever told. The people who lived in Sundaland were not few. Archaeological evidence suggests human presence in this region for at least 50,000 years. Homo sapiens, Neanderthal relatives like the Denisovans, and even earlier species such as Homo erectus and Homo floresiensis all once lived here, though they likely didn't all meet. Caves in Borneo hold hand stencils over 3,000 years old. Among the oldest known examples of human symbolic art, stone tools have been found buried under volcanic ash in Java. Their design echoing ancient techniques used across Asia and even parts of Africa, and in pockets of limestone caves across Malaysia. In Thailand, skeletal remains hint at the existence of societies small, mobile, but persistent, who lived near rivers and hunted forest game. But the land was not still. The end of the ice age began a slow catastrophe, starting around 19,000 years ago and accelerating after 14,000. The planet warmed. Glaciers retreated. The sea rose. Not all at once, a few centimeters each year, but enough. In just a few millennia, rivers turned brackish, lakes became bays, forests drowned, whole valleys places where people had built shelters. Hunted, carved, art vanished beneath the tides by around 8,000 years ago. Much of Sundaland had disappeared. Only the highlands remained, what we now call the islands of Southeast Asia, and the survivors. They moved uphill. They became islanders, and they carried their memories with them in some of the oldest oral traditions in the region, from the Dayak of Borneo, the Batak of Sumatra, the Minangkabau, the Bugis, the Tagalog. There are repeated references to floods, to vanished ancestors, to migrations by boat from lands now gone. These are not biblical floods. They are not one-time events. They are slow disasters, generational, centuries-long stories where the water rose every year, where the land cracked and the sea came in, where the mountain became the coast. Even today, many of these cultures build their houses on stilts not just for practicality, but out of a quiet memory, a cultural echo. What drowned was not just land, it was infrastructure, civilization. Some researchers suggest that the earliest Austroasiatic and Austronesian languages families that now stretch across the Pacific and Indian Oceans might have originated in Sundaland. Linguistic patterns suggest that speakers of these languages moved outward as the sea came in. Others believe that the distinctive boat-building technologies seen cross-island Southeast Asia double outriggers, carved prows, wind-cradled sails began here, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. When the forest paths were flooded, new ones had to be found on water, and perhaps, most intriguingly, there is still debated, but compelling, that Sunland might be the real world. Memory behind later myths of sunken lands. Not just Atlantis, but stories from India, China, and Polynesia that all describe a time when the sea took everything, from the Tamil epics of Kamari, Kandam, to the Javanese tales of lost kingdoms under the sea. The themes repeat: land, lost, to water, knowledge, carried away, a people forced to adapt or vanish. What remains of Sunland today lies hidden beneath silt, coral, and modern shipping lanes. The Java Sea is shallow, less than 100 meters, in many places, making it one of the best preserved ancient landscapes under the ocean. And while it's difficult to excavate underwater, new technologies are helping. Seafloor mapping has revealed ancient riverbeds now submerged. Geological cores taken from the seabed show pollen from now extinct plants, jungle plants, not marine ones. And most fascinatingly, archaeologists using underwater drones have found signs of stone arrangements, possible hearths, and human-modified landscapes beneath the water off the coast of Borneo and Sumatra. It is slow work and expensive. Piece by piece, a picture is emerging. A picture of a world that was not exotic, but home. Not paradise, but normal. And that is perhaps the strangest part of Sundaland's story. Its loss wasn't written down. It wasn't recorded. In stone, or in bronze, or even in clay. It was absorbed into memory, into the rhythms of music, the shapes of boats, the direction of wind beliefs and burial rites. And now, millennia later, we must try to read those memories backward, to see in the shape of a song the outline of a drowned river, to hear in a myth the ripple of an old lake's edge, to walk the beaches of modern Malaysia and imagine not a coastline, but a mountain. This is what history asks of us, to see not only what is, but what once was, and to ask how much of the past lies just beneath the surface, not just of the ocean, but of our minds. In the quiet hours of the night, when the tide is low and the wind still, you might listen for it, the memory of a land your ancestors may have crossed, where elephants once roamed through rainforests that now lie under coral, and people lit fires in places now visited only by sharks and silence. A land drowned slowly is forgotten quickly, but never truly gone, not entirely, because you carry it, even now, even now. Now, let the waters rise slowly in your imagination. Let the forests of Sundaland shiver, not from wind, but from the pressure of a creeping tide that comes not in a storm, but across centuries. A kind of silence begins to spread, a silence not caused by death, but by distance between what once was land and what now is sea. And somewhere, quietly, the maps begin to forget. You see, no ancient cartographer ever drew the full outline of Sundaland. There was no grand map etched in stone or painted on animal hide, showing its sweeping rivers, its humid floodplains, its wooded inland, plateaus, because the maps we inherited, those scraps of parchment from Greece, India, China, were drawn after the water had already arrived. Sundaland had already become an archipelago. The idea of it as one thing had already been lost, but evidence lingers, and you don't need a compass to find it. You only need to follow the clues scattered in myth, language, and the overlooked habits of survival in the old languages of Southeast Asia that predate modern states. There's a kind of echo, words, for both that appear in dozens of dialects from Vietnam to Borneo, with only slight changes. Words from mountain that remain constant across distant islands. Even ideas like rice, tide, and ancestor seem to belong to a common linguistic ancestor. It suggests that long ago, the people of these lands were connected not by sea lanes, but by footpaths, rivers, and shared memory. And when the waters rose, the language spread with them, not through conquest, but through endurance. And as the sea crept inland, people turned toward the forests that remained above the rising edge. They built new settlements uphill. They shifted their shrines and their stories. And perhaps most importantly, they began to adapt their tools. This is where the archaeology becomes oddly personal. In cave systems across the Malay Peninsula, in southern Thailand, in Borneo's interior, we find layers of human activity that tell a strange story. A people who once hunted forest animals began to eat more shellfish. The stone tools, once suited for butchering game, begin to show where from. Scraping mollusks, there are signs of fire pits near coastal caves that didn't used to be coastal in some places. We see the bones of large deer now extinct on these islands, suggesting that what is now jungle or reef was once grassland. And in rare moments, we find something even more human. Traces of children, footprints in hardened mud deep in caves that are now partially underwater. They don't walk in straight lines. They skip. They turn. They suggest games or chasing or wandering in a world whose boundaries were slowly shifting. And above those layers, a newer straight to tools adapted for fishing. Hooks, net weights, traces of canoe-like vessels carved from fallen trees. Boats became not just a tool, but a way of being. The Austronesian peoples whose descendants would go on to settle islands as far apart as Madagascar and Hawaii began here. From the drowned land of Sundaland, they didn't set sail out of curiosity. They were born into a world of disappearing ground, and so they learned to live where the ground never stayed still. The sea, once an intruder, became a road, and that shift from land-based hunter to maritime navigators may be one of the most profound cultural transformations in human history. It didn't happen in a day, or a year, or even a generation. It took centuries, imagine, for a moment. Being one of those people, you live in a village that your grandparents say used to be near a great river, but the river mouth is now brackish, and your nets come back heavier with saltwater fish. The trees are changing. The winds are different. The stories your elders tell speak of a lake that no longer exists, of a mountain that is now an island. You adapt. You teach your children not to hunt deer in the woods. There are no more deer. Instead, you show them how to carve a canoe. You learn the tides by the moon's slow eye. You begin to listen to the sea not as enemy, but as an unpredictable neighbor. This slow turning from forest to seas, not something most civilizations survive, but Sundaland did not die. It transformed. Its people did not vanish. They scattered, adapted, rooted, and they took with them not just their skills, but their memory. This is why, in the furthest corners of Oceania, still hear whispers of floods in ancestral songs. Why the indigenous peoples of Taiwan share cultural traits with tribes in Madagascar. Why the outrigger canoe shows up in both Borneo and Easter Island. They were all once connected by land, and later by what that land taught them before it disappeared. And yet, when European cartographers came centuries later, they saw only dots. Java, Sumatra, Borneo, Timor. They drew coastlines, labeled ports, measured sea lanes, but the land that connected it all was invisible. They did not see Sundland. Even today, most textbooks don't. And perhaps that's the most haunting part, that a continent could disappear, and no one remembered to record it. Not because it wasn't important, but because it disappeared slowly, quietly, without battle, without inscription, without monuments, just a rising tide and stories that slowly stopped. It's making sense. The myth of a mountain that moved, the tale of a city that once had no sea, the strange word for river, used by people who have only known salt. These are the seed, ghost maps of Sundland. Not on paper, but in people. Even the animals remembered today. The islands of Southeast Asia share strangely similar fauna. The tapirs of Malaysia and Sumatra, the orangutans of Borneo, and parts of northern Sumatra, the now extinct elephant that once walked what is now the Java Sea. Their presence suggests something simple. They did not swim here. They walked once, long ago. And so, the next time you look at a map of Asia, squint a little. Let your eyes blur the borders of ocean, okay? And land. Let the sea recede. See the bridges that once were. And ask yourself, how much of history has been lost, not in fire or war, but in the soft retreat of memory, pulled back by tides we no longer feel? What happens to the past when it disappears without disaster, when it simply drowns? And are we still, even now, carrying stories we don't understand, memories we mistake for myth? Because history is not just what is written, it is what is remembered and what is forgotten beneath the sea. The sea, beneath the shifting tides of Southeast Asia, lies a world whose bones are made of drowned mountains and whose stories whisper through silt and silence. You cannot see Sunland on a modern map, okay? But if you let the mind drift, you unlearn the lines of the present coast and follow the ancient riverbeds now buried in the seabed, you begin to glimpse something vast, something that once breathed with forests, herds, villages, firelight, okay, and vanished not with a roar, but with a sigh. This is not a story about catastrophe. Not really. It's a story about endurance, about how memory lingers even when the ground beneath our feet does not dot in the centuries after the sea took the heart of Sundaland. Its legacy drifted outward in the people who left, those who followed the receding land with sails made of woven reed, those who turned hills into islands and rivers into currents. The people did not call themselves refugees. They were not fleeing, okay? They were adjusting. Some archaeologists refer to it as the Austronesian expansion, but that name doesn't quite capture the rhythm of what happened. It suggests a forceful, spreader colonization, a campaign, a push outward. But the people of Sundaland didn't expand in conquest. They adapted by dispersion. They learned to ride the tide. They took their stories, their seeds, their gods, and moved with the water. What you see today when you look at Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia's not the full story. It is the highlands of a vanished world. Tease, what is missing is the glue, the land between. The villages now submerged, the ancient footpaths now mapped only by fish. The great rivers of the Ice Age, like the Sunda River, its channels now lie hidden beneath the Java Sea once joined this world together. And, as the sea rose, those connections were not erased immediately. For a time, memory filled the gaps. There are folktales in Borneo about journeys to a mountain now underwater. In southern Thailand, old fishermen speak of ruins beneath the shallow stone shapes that catch nets and are whispered about, but never named. And on the island of Java, there are songs whose refrains mention forests that grew where salt now stings. These are not just metaphors, they are cartographies of memory in the field of geomythology, the study of how oral traditions preserve geological and climatic truth. Sundaland is a case study. Many of the flood myths of Southeast Asia do not describe single calamitous events, like the biblical flood. They describe slow losses of rice fields turning brackish, of ancestors moving to higher ground, of the land that once joined two places, now swallowed by water. The memory of water, it turns out, is long, not just in stories, but in bones. Human remains discovered in caves like Naja in Borneo and Taban in the Philippines show that people lived in these regions continuously even as the land around them changed shape. Some of the earliest tools found are tens of thousands of years old, far older than the invention of writing or agriculture. These people didn't record the sea's rise with dates and diagrams. They recorded it in behavior, in settlement, in silence. They stopped living in one place and began building there, homes on stilts. They stopped hunting large animals and learned to trap crabs and oysters. They began using boats, not just for fishing, but for moving from one home to the next. Sundaland didn't vanish in a moment. It evolved into something new, and so did the people. One of the most mysterious legacies of this transformation is the way seafaring itself became embedded in culture. The Austronesians didn't just sail, they became sailing cultures. In some societies, the canoe was not a tool, but a living ancestor. In others, navigation was done not with compasses or stars, but by reading the patterns of waves, the flight of birds. The smell of distant islands taught to sail was not to escape, it was to remember a land that no longer existed. And that brings us to an odd detail. What the sea preserved, what it erased. You would think that the ocean, in covering this great landmass, obliterated all signs of what came before. But in some places, it did the opposite. In the shallows off the coast of Vietnam and Malaysia, divers have found traces of old riverbeds, significant drainage systems that once fed into the great rivers of Sundaland. These lines, now etched in sand and coral, suggest a landscape that was not chaotic, but structured. There were valleys, floodplains, and even terraces in other places, like the Gulf of Thailand. Satellite imagery reveals faint outlines of old coastlines, lines that correspond not with myth, but with the ancient migration routes of animals and people. It's as though the sea, in swallowing the land, left behind a ghost map, a fingerprint of what once was, and in some places, the sea kept even more. Consider the submerged archaeological site at Ulu Leong in Sulawesi. There, deep in the limestone caves now, near the sea, are paintings, hand stencils, animal figures, geometric designs dated to more than 40,000 years ago. These are among the oldest known works of human art. They were painted long before the sea arrived, and now they remain, cradled by stone, guarded by humidity, visited by bats and scientists alike. This is the paradox of Sundaland. It is both forgotten and preserved, erased from the maps, etched into memory, gone from the textbooks, live in the blood of millions. across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And the more we learn, the more we see just how much the rise of the sea shaped who we are. Because Sundaland's disappearance was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a maritime world. It taught humans how to live, not just on land or with water. It forced them to adapt, not with tools alone, but with imagination. It is no coincidence that the descendants of these drowned peoples would one day cross the open Pacific in double-hulled canoes, using the stars and waves as their only guides, reaching islands no map had ever named. They were not discovering, they were remembering. The Polynesians, the Micronesians, the coastal Malays, the seafaring tribes of Indonesia, the Malagasy of Madagascar, all children of the flood, all heirs of Sundaland. And today, as climate change once again brings rising seas, it's worth asking, what did they know that we have forgotten? What kind of knowledge allowed them to survive the slow disappearance of everything they knew? Perhaps the memory of water was not just about loss, but resilience, not just mourning, but movement. And perhaps the lesson of Sundaland is this, that when land disappears, it is not always the end. It can be the start of a new way of seeing, a new way of living, a new kind of history, one written not in stone or ink, but in the pulse of tides, the arc of sails, the rhythm of a paddle in a dark sea under stars. Sundaland may be gone from the earth's surface, but it remains quietly in the stories we still don't fully understand, and the sea remembers always, always. You stand in a landscape made of dust and silence. The sun hovers low over the horizon, staining the horizon the color of burnt clay. In every direction, you see the same rhythm: cracked earth, flat plains, scattered stone mounds, and the ruins of mud brick cities that once rose like islands in a sea of green. But it was not always this way. Before the deserts, before the ruins, there was water, and before the Bible, before the Epic of Gilgamesh, before even the myths that whispered through the oldest Sumerian tablets, there was memory, buried in layers of mud, hardened in clay, etched in signs long forgotten by most of the world. This is not the story of one flood. It is the story of many, a series of quiet drownings, some sudden, some slow, that reshaped not just the land of Mesopotamia, but the minds of the people who lived between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Floods carved the very foundation of what we now call civilization, not because they destroyed it, but because they forced people to remember, to record, to tell stories. And so, deep within the soil of southern Iraq, archaeologists have unearthed more than bricks and bones. They've uncovered the first stories ever told, thousands of years before Homer, before Genesis, before the Mahabharata, or the Norse sagas. The people of Mesopotamia were writing, not with alphabets, but with impressions, careful wedges pressed into wet clay using a stylus cut from reed. These tablets were left to dry in the sun or baked in fire, and many of them still survive. On some of them, scribes wrote about barley, taxes. Others kept lists of animals or trades. Some recorded temple rituals or royal edicts. But among the oldest and most haunting are the stories that begin with water. One tablet, discovered in the ruins of ancient Nineveh, tells a version of a tale that may sound familiar. A god warns a righteous man of a coming flood. He is told to build a great boat, to gather animals, to prepare for the waters. The flood comes, sweeping away the wicked. The boat survives. The man makes a sacrifice. The gods regret their destruction. A rainbow appears. You may know it as the story of Noah, but this version predates the book of Genesis by over 1,000 years. The man's name in this telling is Utnapishtim, and his story is carved into the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Sumerian Akkadian masterpiece that scholars call the first great work of world literature. But it's more than literature. It is memory. It's hardened into clay. because the flood that inspired it was not metaphorical, was real. In the 1920s, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley led a team to excavate the city of Ur, one of the great Sumerian capitals. As they dug beneath the city's foundations, they passed through layers of human settlement, debris, and ash. And then, suddenly, they hit an untouched layer of sterile mud, more than 10 feet thick, devoid of human artifacts. Beneath that mud were the remains of an even older civilization. Woolley concluded that the city of Ur had been destroyed and buried by an enormous flood, which then receded, allowing a new city to be built on top. He believed he had found the flood of legend, the event that birthed the earliest flood myths of Mesopotamia. Later scholars would debate the scale of this flood. Was it truly regional? Did it affect all of Mesopotamia or only parts of it? Was it caused by the Euphrates bursting its banks or a shift in rainfall patterns far upstream? The answers remain unclear, but what is clear is that the people who lived through these floods saw them not as isolated events, but as cosmic resets. To them, the flood was not just water. It was divine judgment, purification, a cleansing of corruption, and the beginning of something new. This view echoed across cities and centuries. Each time a flood command, they came often, brought on by the unpredictable behavior of rivers in a flat, unprotected landscape. The people remembered, and they rewrote the memory to suit their time. In Eridu, a city once thought to be the oldest in the world, priests told of how kingship descended from the heavens, only to be swept away in a flood, along with the first divine city in Lagash, a Sumerian city-state. Scribes inscribed laments for lost temples and drowned fields, describing floods as the tears of gods too sorrowful to contain their grief. In Sippar, records speak of a great deluge that washed away all knowledge, until a wise king stored wisdom in a tablet of lapis lazuli, bearing it in a hidden chamber for future generations. These are not identical stories, but they rhyme, because the memory of water is collective, and that memory shaped the very architecture of Mesopotamian civilization. You can see it in the ziggurats, massive stepped towers, built not just as temples, but as high places, safe above the floodwaters. You can see it in the canal systems, the levees, the dikes and artificial riverbanks that formed some of the world's earliest hydraulic engineering projects. You can see it in the layout of cities. It's often walled and elevated, with drains designed not for rainfall rare in the region, but for the sudden arrival of rising rivers. To live in Mesopotamia was to live on borrowed land, land stolen from the rivers and constantly at risk of being reclaimed. And so, the people wrote. They wrote about gods and kings, but always returned to water. It was water that gave life through irrigation and trade. It was water that took life through flood and famine, and it was water that gave meaning through story. When you trace the spread of Mesopotamian influence across the ancient world, from the Levant to Anatolia, from Persia to Egypt, you begin to see how deeply this idea of the flood embedded itself into civilization's foundation. Even in cultures with different geographies, different climates, different rivers, the memory lingered. And this raises a curious question. Why? Was the flood the first story? Why not fire, or drought, or war? Perhaps it's because the flood is the most total loss. Fire leaves ashes, war leaves bones, drought leaves dust. But flood erases everything. It sweeps clean. It turns temples into puddles, kings into silt, cities into reflections. It leaves no trace, only mud. And in that blankness, story is all that remains. And, perhaps, in some way, we have always known this, that the earliest civilizations, for all their complexity, were always standing on soft ground, that beneath the bricks and statues and monuments, there is always mud, waiting. You are now standing at the edge of a canal. The air is warm, heavy with the scent of damp reeds and sun-baked mud. Dragonflies hover above the still water, their wings catching the light like fragments of forgotten glass. This is not a dream, though it feels like one. This is ancient Sumer before writing became writing, before kings wore crowns, before the world believed it was old in the canal. Carved by hand using stone tools and woven baskets is more than a ditch for water. It is a promise to the river. A compromise with the flood, because Mesopotamian life was never about defeating nature. Teeming to an extent, appeasing, certainly, but never conquering, for they knew the flood would always return after the flood's receded weather, after a single night of rain or a generation of rising rivers. The survivors would begin again, and each time they did something very specific. They wrote it down in wet clay, shaped into tablets, in royal hymns, in votive offerings, in lists of kings who reigned before the flood. This was the strange power of Mesopotamian civilization. It believed that history was fragile, but memory could be hardened. That mud in the right hands could become eternal. And so, the people turned their flood-soaked memories into records, an act of defiance as much as devotion. While their temples crumbled and their fields turned to sludge, their tablets endured. Imagine that, a civilization haunted by water, and yet its words have outlived its walls. They did not call it Mesopotamia. That's a Greek term meaning land between rivers. To its inhabitants, it was Kangar, the land of the civilized lords, sometimes simply the black-headed people's land. But whatever the name, its rhythm was shaped by the rise and fall of waters. The twin rivers Tigris and Euphrates were lifelines, but also harbingers. Their floods were not like the Nile's, whose yearly swelling was regular, even celebratory. The rivers of Mesopotamia could be cruelly inconsistent. One year, they would deliver rich silt and nourishment. The next, they would rise too soon or too late. Tay would breach their channels, swallow homes, erase harvests. And still, people stayed. Why? Because the mud was rich, or because the clay was plentiful. Because once you learned the river's language, it could be coaxed into serving you. You see this mindset etched into the earliest writings, not poetry, but logistics. The first known written documents are not epics. They are inventories, receipts, lists of grain rations, tallies of cattle, allocations of beer. Because, after a flood, the most urgent task was not to tell a story, was to remember who had what, who owed whom, what had been lost, and what had been rebuilt. These dull details, names and numbers, quantities and weights, the true bones of civilization. They held the memory of survival, and as cities like Eridu, Ur, and Nippur emerged from the mud, their people began to refine their writing system. What began as pictograms evolved into cuneiform, method of wedge-shaped impressions that could be pressed quickly and consistently into clay. With this new tool, memory became modular. Clerks could copy texts, priests could record rituals, kings could boast of conquests, and yes, scribes could record the floods, not just the physical ones, but the metaphysical ones, the floods of fear, the floods of forgetting. They wrote of the gods, Enlil, who stirred the winds, Ki, lord of the deep waters, Inanna, whose moods brought both fertility and ruin. And in these myths, floods were never simple weather events. Te were judgments, or tests, or warnings. One tablet describes how the gods, angered by the noise and disorder of humanity, decided to cleanse the world. They chose to destroy their creation with a flood. But one god warned a mortal Atrahasis and instructed him to build a boat. This tale predates even the epic of Gilgamesh. Another version tells of how the gods regretted their decision after the flood passed. They were hungry. There were no more sacrifices, no more prayers, no more temples. The silence, they realized, was worse than the noise. It's hard not to hear echoes of these stories in later religious texts, but more importantly, it shows us how the people of ancient Mesopotamia processed disaster. They didn't deny it. They ritualized it. Every major city had temples with flood rituals, ceremonies of appeasement, priests who interpreted omens and the weather and the river foam. Offerings were made, chants recited, statues bathed, not to prevent the flood, but to prepare for its meaning, because, in their view, the world was not stable, it was cyclical. What rose would fall, what was built would be unbuilt. Yet, by remembering, by recording, the people could carry forward some small part of what came before in this way. The flood was not only an end, it was a beginning. The best example of this might be found in the ancient Sumerian king list, a curious document that combines history and myth in one continuous line. It lists kings who ruled before the flood for impossibly long reigns, 28,800 years, 36,000 years. Then comes the flood, described as a line break, a rupture, and after that, the kings return. But their reigns are shorter, more human. The flood, in this list, divides the divine from the mortal. It is the moment history begins, and yet, even this was preserved in mud. Think about that. The flood washes away memory, but clay preserves it. That contradiction sits at the heart of Mesopotamian legacy, and it leads to a strange reflection. Is it possible that flood was not just an event in their history, but their foundation myth, precisely because it mirrored their greatest fear? Not death, but forgetting. We often think of ancient civilizations as being obsessed with gods, with power, with immortality. But perhaps Mesopotamia was obsessed with something more subtle: continuity. The idea that after disaster, anything could remain. A number on a tablet, a god's name, a list of sheep. And so, in a world where rivers rose and fell without warning, the scribes wrote. In city after city, from Nineveh to Mari, from Uruk to Kish, they carved their records into clay, not to impress future generations, but to survive their own. Today, many of these tablets lie in museums, warehouses, or still half buried in the sands of Iraq and Syria. Thousands have never been translated. Some were broken by time, others by war. Some disappeared in floods of their own modern ones, and yet, the ones that remain still whisper, not loudly, not clearly, but patiently, like water soaking through soil. You are walking now, slowly, through a land that appears quiet. The reeds have overtaken the edges of the old canal. Dust settles over forgotten clay bricks, the kind pressed with reeds by hand thousands of years ago. A few dark shapes on the horizon mark where ziggurats once stood, or might still be standing beneath heaps of earth and erosion. You're not sure? And that's exactly the point. Because this part of history, the part that sleeps under your feet, is made of water and absence. This is Mesopotamia, not as it was, but as it remains shadows of cities. It's fragments of lists and dreams interrupted by flood. We tend to think of floods as past events, disasters overcome, recorded, and stored in archives. But in southern Iraq, the flood is not over. It was never truly over. The landscape still pulses with the memory of water. Salt creeps into the earth from ancient seabeds. The rivers still change course with no warning. And beneath that fragile crust of civilization, entire libraries may still lie submerged in layers of clay and silt. We begin, then, with the question: what has not yet been found, and what may never be? Let's talk about the lost texts. We know that ancient Mesopotamians kept libraries, real ones, not just in palaces or temples, but in private homes. Tablet was not expensive. Scribe might carry dozens in a simple woven satchel. In the cities of Nippur and Sippar, in Ur and Nineveh, Entire rooms were lined with shells, rows and rows of baked and unbaked clay. In fact, the oldest known library in the world comes from the ruins of Ebla in modern-day Syria, dating back to around 2500 BCE. Over 1,800 tablets were found there. That's only what survived. Then there's the more famous library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh to the 7th century BC, where the Epic of Gilgamesh was discovered, along with spells, legal records, omens, and mathematical tables. And yet, even that is just a sliver. You see, when cities were sacked, the tablets were often tossed aside. Many were never fired in a kill. A flood or fire would reduce them to unrecognizable mush. And that means most of what was written in Mesopotamia is now gone, not translated, not buried, just disintegrated. Think of that for a moment. An entire civilization, one of the earliest and most literate, had more surviving documents than the Greeks or Romans at one point. And now the majority of its words have returned to mud. And yet, the codes remain. Some archaeologists believe that vast sections of southern Iraq, currently impassable due to marshes, shifting riverbeds, or political instability, may contain whole cities that haven't been touched since they were abandoned. Beneath the surface, undisturbed. Might be another version of the Sumerian king list, another library like Ashurbanipal's, another collection of prayers, economic records, or flood myths. They may never be found, or they may already have been found, but never translated. You see? There are hundreds of thousands of Mesopotamian tablets sitting in museum archives around the world, in Berlin, London, Istanbul, and especially in the British Museum. Some have been studied, most have not. They are tagged with basic information, object number, date, location, for their contents. Untranslated, UNCATALOGUED.in yet. They contain the voices of people who survived the flood again and again. A record of barley, rations for temple workers, a message from a king to his steward about irrigation dikes, a school child's handwriting, practice on a practice tablet, a merchant's prayer to avoid losses during the rainy season. Each tablet is small, forgettable, and written in a language that takes years to master. And yet each one is a portal. Each one is a survival. And still the mud calls louder than the words. Consider the archaeology of floodplains. In Mesopotamia, cities were often built on alluvium-soft, river-laid sediment that is excellent for farming, but terrible for preserving anything above ground. Temples were made of mud brick. When abandoned, they didn't decay like stone, they dissolved. Add to this the fact that the Tigris and Euphrates regularly shifted their course by miles over the centuries, and you begin to see why so little remains. Entire urban centers were swallowed by marsh, buried under silt, cord simply eroded back into the riverbank, and yet traces linger in 2019. Archaeologists working in Iraq's Dekar province uncovered the remnants of a 4,000-year-old city that contained roads, homes, and traces of agriculture. It had no name. It matched no known records. It had simply re-emerged, decades after being mistaken for a mound of debris. How many such cities wait to be found? How many flood stories were written and washed away before we had names for them? Now step back. Think again of the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the flood scene occurs in that poem. Possibly the oldest written story in human history, Gilgamesh meets Utamish, the Mesopotamian Noah, who tells him how the gods sent a flood to destroy humankind. The tale mirrors, in striking detail, the later stories in Hebrew and Greek texts, a divine warning, an ark, animals taken aboard, and a dove released when the waters subside. But this was not just a myth. It was memory, restructured. The flood was real. Maybe not in that precise form. Maybe not that deep or that global. But Mesopotamian history was shaped by repeated catastrophic floods, rivers that refused to stay in their channels, deluges that drowned entire districts. You can even see sediment layers in ancient city walls, dark bands of silt between older and newer bricks, layers that mark the line between loss and rebuilding. And each rebuilding came with a ritual, a new prayer, a new tablet, a new attempt to organize the unpredictable in this way. The Mesopotamians were not only early engineers and astronomers, they were early curators of trauma. They knew the flood would return. They didn't try to stop it. They just tried to remember, in a world where gods were angry and rivers unforgiving. The only real power was documentation, to write what was lost, to name what had vanished, to preserve what mattered, however dull, however small. A debt list, a boundary marker, a grain measurement. Even now, you can visit museums where these tablets are displayed. Most are beige, quaint, the size of a palm, with tiny wedge marks arranged in rows. They are quiet, unassuming, but when you look closely, you see not just text, you see survival. A shopkeeper tallying his stock after the flood. Priest recording sacrifices as the temple dries. A scribe noting how many bricks were used in the rebuilding of a collapsed wall. It's not exciting history. It's not dramatic, but it's all that's left. And maybe that's enough. Because as you drift off tonight, consider this. The great ziggurats have eroded. The temples are gone. The kings are forgotten. But a few tablets remained, shaped from the same mud that once threatened to erase them. And inside those tablets are the last whispers of a people who faced the flood not once, again and again, responded, not with monuments or wars, but with the quiet resolve to write it all down, even if no one would read it, even if it would return to dust, even if it might never be found. They wrote anyway, and perhaps that is the most human thing of all. Asterisk. Good night. ...